Good morning, everybody. Handouts should be coming around to everyone. Begin today with a word of prayer. Almighty God, as your only begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, ascended into the heavens, so may we also ascend in heart and mind and continually dwell there with him, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Amen. Well, we're on a roll of kind of maybe kicking at the goads of the current culture and things, talking about homosexuality and transgenderism. So now we'll talk about abortion as well, considering the current status of what seems to be an expected overturning of opinion from the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, and what maybe those implications are. Things have maybe the fervor over that has maybe died down recently. It's kind of typical of our culture. It seems like just sort of from one flashpoint to another, which I don't think is necessarily all that healthy either. But so just briefly on what's expected if Roe versus Wade is overturned, clarity and truth is really an important thing as far as what's going to happen federally and then states-wise if Roe v. Wade is overturned. It will be the statement that says that the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over abortion. And so we return to the states for each individual state to decide what their various restrictions or permissions may in fact be. That's what it's going to be. So some states like California, New York already has laws in place, and other progressive, whatever you want to call it, states will probably enable abortions as it currently stands under Roe, which is there can be no restrictions up to and including the 9th month now, right? That there can be abortions performed there if it's deemed medically necessary. It's something. So it's if a doctor is willing to perform it, is what it comes down to, is according to the decision. So basically, if the doctor is willing to do it, then it can be done. So this will return it to the states for them to decide. I imagine states like Ohio will probably get various heartbeat bills and things like that in place. We'll probably have more restrictive laws on abortion, and I think that's wonderful. So in the days after the leak of the decision, poor girl. It's okay. It's okay.
Are you beating that girl?
No. Kids are kids. They have their moments. So, you can catch an elbow. Okay. So, in the days afterwards, there was a lot of on social media and things about what the sort of doom and gloom from the pro-abortion side, saying, oh, if this passes, if this happens, this is what's going to happen to assault on women and all these various things. So I want to look at and there were some emails and posts and various things that went around, and just it's important that we counteract some of these, that we try to speak some truth to these false narratives, these false assumptions about what pro-life legislation might result in, and various things like that. So perhaps you saw a series of posts, it's like, well, you may be pro-life, but I'm pro, and all these women's names and scenarios that try to suggest that if you're pro-life, then if you're pro-life, then you're against the mother, or that you don't care about what might be happening to women in these various individual situations, which is a false narrative. And you'll see from some of these descriptions of things that abortion restrictions would have no impact on the scenarios of what they're trying to describe here. So what they're describing here are not abortions, but sometimes they're normal courses of, well, typical courses, involuntary courses of pregnancy that may result in the death of a child, which is not an abortion. An abortion is the willful, elective ending of a developing human life. That's an abortion. So most of these cases that they're describing here aren't even abortions. In the cases where abortion restrictions are even put out, there's a lot of discussion about, well, doesn't there have to be restrictions or allowances for what about the life of the mother, and what about cases of rape and incest? There have to be exceptions for those cases. And we'll talk about some of those here, but in the case of a fatal risk to the mother, you're not talking about an abortion. You're talking about treating a pregnancy complication that is life-threatening to the mother, and that as you care for the mother, the secondary effect of that care, unintentional, undirected, is that the child would die. That's distinctly different from an elective abortion deliberately ending the life of a developing human child. So it says, like, well, you may be pro-life, but I'm pro-Teresa, who hemorrhaged during the placental abruption, causing her parent, spouse, and child to have to make the impossible decision on whether to save her or her unborn child. I mean, that's whether it's uterine hemorrhaging or ectopic pregnancies is another much more common than you might realize. Complication of a pregnancy is to sort of say, well, if we pass a restriction on abortion, then you're sentencing to death, a woman like this hypothetical Teresa or somebody with an ectopic pregnancy, which is utterly false. It's absolutely false. Even if we restricted abortion 100%, the treating of caring for this woman, Teresa, would not involve an abortion of her child, but they would either, depending on how far along, they could deliver the child naturally or C-section. We can sustain life and nurture life in incubation and NICUs very early on now. 24 weeks now, I think, is the youngest. I think here in Cleveland Clinic, they were able to. So, we can save that life much more early on. The goal would be to care for the mother, to stop her bleeding, to make sure that she's not going to die, and if in that course of treatment the child does die, that was not the intent of the treatment. It's what was the intent of the treatment, and then what would happen there. Ectopic pregnancy is another example of this. That an ectopic pregnancy is when after sperm and egg fusion, the developing embryo travels through the fallopian tube, and rather than entering into the fallopian tubes and into the uterus to attach there, it attaches outside of the uterus. This is a fatal condition for the child, and poses a severe risk to the mother of her life also. This is a real thing. It happens often, and is not encompassed under any restrictions on abortion. The care for a mother with an ectopic pregnancy results in the death of the child, yes, but that is not the intent of that procedure. If we develop medical procedure later on that can perhaps relocate that pregnancy into the uterus and attach it there, that brings it into a different case. That's a whole other story. But an ectopic pregnancy would not be restricted. Treatment for an ectopic pregnancy would not be restricted under even a full abortion elimination. Okay? There is a group called American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. This is on toward the very end of this. I meant to move it up in the slides. Their director is a woman named Dr. Donna Harrison. She's Lutheran. She is a wonderful doctor and a fantastic advocate for life, and just helps clarify and just talk about life and pregnancy and treatment and all these things in just really terrific ways. I got to work with her while coordinating some discussions about in vitro fertilization and embryo adoption and some of these life issues at the synod level. I got to work with her on those, and she's just absolutely fantastic. We should have her come to Cleveland and talk, because she just lives in Western Michigan, so it'd be great to have her. But down in the description of this video online is links to this article, and then the AAPLOG, you got it, their site, and a lot of the resources that they have there. So coming from medical professionals, tops of their field, discussing why abortion is not medical care. It's not health care. It's contrary to the Hippocratic Oath. It's contrary to just general ethics and morals, and certainly Christian ethics and morals. Yeah, Mike.
Did you say she worked in the Cleveland Clinic, or she spoke
No. The mentioning of Cleveland Clinic was sustaining life in a NICU at 24 weeks.
Okay.
So no, she lives in Western Michigan. It'd be great to have her come and speak here in the city, though. That'd be fantastic. So the American College of OBGYNs put out a statement about understanding ectopic pregnancy, and just sort of saying, like, oh, if we restrict abortion, then we're gonna harm women who have these ectopic pregnancies. And so the pro-life OBGYNs responded that said, yes, absolutely agree that facts are important, and that the timely diagnosis of an ectopic pregnancy is essential for excellent health care for women. We do not agree that the restrictions on abortion limit a physician's ability to treat ectopic pregnancies. So here are physicians saying, no, we can restrict abortion, and it's not going to prevent us from treating women with ectopic pregnancies. Ectopic pregnancy is a life-threatening condition. And treating it is not the same thing as performing an abortion. And yet, the College of OBGYN's statement conflates the two, which leads to confusion not only for physicians, but also for policymakers. So policymakers will then echo and say, well, we have to make provisions for the life of the mother. It's like, well, what provisions are we talking about? Because we're talking about physical threat and harm to their livelihood, to their life. The treating of that does not conflict with a rejection of abortion. Although treatment for ectopic pregnancy results in the unfortunate death of the embryo, this is not the intent of the treatment. The intent is to save the life of the mother. The sole intent of an abortion is to end the life of a developing human being. So you see the distinction there. It's the difference between administering morphine to a patient near the end of life who's having trouble breathing, and administering a lethal dose of morphine in order to kill them. Same medicine, same situation. One, its intent is to treat them and to give them comfort care and sustain them, and the other is to deliberately cause death. Distinctly different things. For example, we would probably typically agree that that coming up to somebody and hitting them in the chest repeatedly so that their ribs break should be an illegal act.
Absolutely.
In most situations.
Yeah, I see where this is going.
Unless you're giving CPR. So you see the situation. It's like, oh, is breaking somebody's ribs always a crime? Well, no, sometimes it saves their life. And so you see the distinction between those two things. It was not done with the intent to physically cause harm or maim them, but it was to save their life was the intent. Same thing with this. We're going to treat the ectopic pregnancy. That does result in the unfortunate death of the embryo, but that was not the purpose of the treatment. So to say that we need to have provisions and abortion restrictions that allow for the life of the mother it's a red herring, because treating a woman whose life is at risk because of a pregnancy is not an abortion. In fact, I don't have it in front of me, but there's a different medical term for that treatment, for the procedure and things that are done. It's not like, oh, we'll do an abortion to treat this ectopic pregnancy. No, it's not what it is at all. So the ACOG statement says an untreated ectopic pregnancy is life-threatening. Withholding or delaying treatment can lead to death. And we agree that with that statement, that you can't delay treatment and it can lead to death. So for that reason, being pro-life, we argue that an ultrasound must be performed prior to a medicated abortion. Can I have a nurse pronounce that word for me? Mifepristone?
Which word are you looking at?
This one.
Fourth and fifth.
Oh, no, I can't see it.
Somebody put yellow.
These two medications.
Oh, those are medications.
Yeah, those two medications.
Mifepristone and mesoprostol.
There's always a different emphasis on the syllables in medications, so I never get them right. Anyway, so those are two medications that are given to induce a chemical abortion. One starves the placenta, and the other one induces labor. So, administering those two drugs does not treat the ectopic pregnancy. If they think they have an ectopic pregnancy and they administer those medications, it's not going to treat the patient because it may evacuate the uterus, but that's not where the pregnancy is happening. Right? And so providing this or any other medication to terminate a presumed but not confirmed intrauterine pregnancy may delay detection and treatment of an ectopic pregnancy. So if somebody, if they test positive for a pregnancy and they want to have a chemically induced abortion, they don't know if it's ectopic or not, and they take this medication, they don't know whether it could have been an ectopic pregnancy or not. And so if they administer this medication to do a chemically induced abortion, it can actually do severe harm to the woman because it's not going to end the ectopic pregnancy, but it is going to cause them to bleed and severe side effects of the medications. So what the pro-life OBGYNs are saying is that we need to first perform an ultrasound to determine if it's an ectopic pregnancy or not. That would be the appropriate first step in diagnosis. When somebody's pregnant, you have to do an ultrasound to make sure it's not an ectopic pregnancy. Even if they were going to go perform an abortion, they should still determine whether it's ectopic or not, because if they do it with the wrong medication, it's going to do additional harm to the mother.
I've never heard that word before. What?
Ectopic?
Yeah. Is it a,
Outside the uterus.
oh,
Like an fallopian.
Yeah. So between the ovaries and the fallopian tube, there's actually a gap
okay.
where the egg kind of has to jump. And if the sperm egg fusion happens still upwards above that, and it becomes, there's fusion and there's a growing embryo at that point, and then it's coming through and it misses the fallopian tube, it can attach in the abdomen instead of in the uterus.
You can also attach in the fallopian.
Or in the fallopian tube as well, right?
Pastor,
So-
what's the name of the doctor? You said Dr. Donna.
Donna Harrison. And if you can find her presentations on things and whatever, she's really fantastic. They go on to say that since women of color are disproportionately at risk for both ectopic pregnancy and for abortion, we know that women of color have significantly higher percentage of the abortions related to the percentage of population. They are also more at risk for ectopic pregnancies. To perform medicated abortions without performing an ultrasound is medically irresponsible. So that's an important distinction to make, is that when we're talking about abortion restrictions, that is not going to impact caring for women who are in life-threatening situations. Unfortunately, medically, they've also gone on to expand the definition of life-threatening to include not just simply life and limb, as in causing the death of the mother, but anything that will disrupt the well-being, livelihood, physical or mental well-being of the mother could then fall under, we need to perform this abortion for the life of the mother. So it's saying, like, oh, this pregnancy is taxing from a mental health standpoint, therefore she has to have an abortion for the state of her well-being. And that's a distinctly different definition than I think we're thinking of when we say, well, I think even pro-life people here, it's like, oh yeah, we don't want to put a restriction that, we can't care for a woman who's dying because she's pregnant. Well, if we don't put that restriction on, then unfortunately they also expand the restriction, the permission for an abortion in those cases to be their emotional well-being as well. Much more intangible and you can't quantify it. It's like you can say, this is a life-threatening situation or this is not. So, even in the case of a woman who perhaps may be pregnant and then diagnosed with cancer, sometimes the doctors will say, well, first thing we need to do is abort your child, and then we can start you on chemo and radiation and things. And that's not necessarily the first step that you have to take. There are ways to treat with chemo and radiation that may harm the child, may cause the death of the child, might happen. The abortion will kill the child. The cancer treatment may cause harm to the child, or it may not. And so there's good reason to choose medical treatments that can preserve the life of the child and treat the woman's cancer at the same time. Both can be done. If in fact it results in a secondary effect of it does harm the child and the child does die, that's not the same as abortion. This is a completely different category of things. The child died of cancer, not of abortion. That makes sense. Go on and look at a couple more of these. Well, you're pro-life, but I'm pro-Vanessa, who went into her confirmation appointment after years, not just years, but years of trying to conceive, only to hear silence where there should be a heartbeat. I don't know what this has to do with abortion. There's nothing. It has to do with a miscarriage. And so this group Live Action is responding to this by saying abortion is an intentional violent attack on a living child. If the child doesn't have a heartbeat, it's likely already passed away, and miscarriage management is not morally or legally an abortion in any way, shape, or form. An abortion restriction would have zero effect on a woman who's had a miscarriage. Zero effect. It's total red herring. It's an appeal to an emotional argument that doesn't have its basis in anything medically or even related to the issue at hand.
When do they get a heartbeat? 18 weeks or?
No. It's like within 5-6 weeks. It's pretty early. Very early. All right, so here's another instance. I'm pro Jessica, finally getting the strength to get away from her physically abusive spouse, only to find out she's carrying, the post says, the monster's child. The editor says, no, that's an innocent child, by the way. And, I'm also pro Lindsay, who lost her virginity in her sophomore year with a broken condom and now has to choose between whether to be a teenage mom or just a teenager. So there's the case of they would say, this is for her mental well-being. This has to be an allowed exception. Well, this pro-life group Live Action says, well, killing a preborn child is not necessary in either of these situations. Adoption is an alternative. And while being a teen mother is not always easy, countless women have shown that it is possible. We're not saying that it's easy. We're not saying that these aren't tragic and difficult and heart-wrenching situations. But the solution to tragic and difficult and heart-wrenching situations is to not commit another tragic, heart-wrenching, and difficult, heinous act of an abortion. So these are not necessary. You know, if the pro-abortion side says, well, the solution to all these things is an abortion, it's like, have you considered any other solution? You know, it's like a doctor saying, you know, it's like, well, you've got skin cancer on your arm, and so our solution is going to be to remove the arm. It's like, we haven't considered any other options. Well, you have to have the right to be able to remove your arm. Can I be treated in a way that isn't quite so traumatic, or that would cause me trauma for the rest of my life, which abortion will cause these women? As difficult as this current situation is, living with having to have gone through an abortion is substantiated to show much higher rates of depression and suicide, and the long-term effects of abortion on mental health are much more severe than the difficulties of being a teenage mother or giving up a child for adoption instead. Pro Emily, who went through in vitro fertilization, ending up with 6 viable implanted eggs requiring selective reduction to ensure the safety of her and a safe number of fetuses. So they reframe this in the terms of safety. Oh, safety for the fetuses. Well, not for the fetuses that you're about to selectively reduce, kill. So, you know, IVF is its own complicated kind of situation exactly for these reasons. So there's no evidence that selective reduction, aborting some of those children and not the others, will save the life of the other children in the womb. It can actually cause the death of some of the other embryos as well. This hypothetical situation highlights the reason for pro-life opposition to IVF, as many of these children are created and treated as extra human beings, later to be destroyed or murdered in selective reduction. So they're either, so the way IVF works is the woman undergoes hyperovulation. They receive injections to ovulate multiple eggs all at once. And then those eggs are collected and brought into a laboratory. First and foremost, the egg collection can be life-threatening. It is not just a simple procedure, and its dangers are vastly underreported. You know where most of the egg donation clinics are set up? Where they're set up near? College campuses. Got a lot of healthy young women who could probably use some money. And they say, well, you come and donate your eggs. But it is a very risky procedure for their present life, but also for their long-term fertility as well. It can completely make them infertile. So that aspect of itself is dangerous. Next, they then take sperm and fuse it with those eggs, so that there are now embryos. And some of those embryos begin growing, some of them don't. Some of them continue growing, and some of them don't. So some of them die, just natural course of things. And it's like 90% begin dividing and then die. So you're already talking about the 90% death rate of the embryos created before any are even implanted. And that in of itself, if you knew that you had a situation where your kids had a 90% risk of dying doing it, would you do it?
No, I don't think so.
Of course not. That'd be mind-boggling. That's why I chose to adopt instead of going through IVF and these sorts of things. That was the point where we were at. We were like, we can't do that. Then they take the ones that are growing, those are examined, and then they're sort of graded then even. The ones that are growing are then graded to say, well, these are the most likely to survive, these are least likely to survive, and some of those are reduced. More death. Then they're implanted, and because not all of them will implant and take into a pregnancy, full pregnancy, multiples are implanted at once with the anticipation that we'll implant 6 and maybe 1 or 2 will actually carry on into a pregnancy. But sometimes, a case like this, or a case like the woman who had 8 children through IVF, and there's multiple others, sometimes more of them take, sometimes all of them take, whatever. And so, again, a standard part of IVF is then selective reduction to bring it down to a safe number of fetuses. The solution to all this isn't to arrive at the point where you need to, where you feel this necessity to perform abortions to create a safe situation. The solution to this is not to create the situation in the first place, especially when you're talking about a situation that is voluntarily avoidable. Don't undergo IVF. When you consider the whole situation, the riskiness of it, and what happens to the vast majority of those embryos and the positions you're put in with it, doesn't seem like a viable, why pro-life, there's pro-life opposition to IVF. It makes them a commodity, a thing. And then if they're not implanted, then they're frozen. And which is no guarantee of their long-term survival anyway. I mean, the being frozen can kill another high percentage of the embryos. And so even the ones that are in stasis, frozen, a large percentage of them have already died. And then you had the case, was it Cleveland Clinic that had a freezer rape?
Oh, yeah.
Was it UH? It was UH. Thousands of frozen embryos died. And I was pretty pleased. I think the Roman Catholic Diocese did a memorial service for them. But then the question is, well, if they're frozen in stasis, who are they? Under the law, they're property. There's no laws showing jurisdiction over them like children. It's really bizarre. It's a bizarre thing. So we should try to do better for life than to freeze embryos. You don't freeze children. That is something we should avoid. This also brings up a different sort of pro-choice, pro-abortion red herring, is that they say things like, oh, well, if you're pro-life and you say, you can't abort a fetus, an embryo, then you're saying every time a woman has her period, or every time a man and wife come together, or they have sex and they don't get pregnant, then all those sperms are abortions. All those eggs during periods are abortions. Aren't you against all that death? It's like, you can't tell the difference between a gamete and an embryo. Well, follow the science, as they would say. I mean, it's like there's a vast difference between those two things. It's an absurd argument, because those aren't independent human lives. It's half the set of chromosomes in each place. All right. Pro Melissa, who's working 2 jobs just to make ends meet and has to choose between bringing another child into poverty or feeding the children she already has because her spouse walked out on her. Or Pro Brittany, who realizes that she is in no way financially, emotionally, or physically able to raise a child. Well, abortion doesn't solve poverty. In fact, it's statistically shown to make poverty worse. And parents would never be allowed to kill one of their born children because they're having difficulty affording necessities. Right? We wouldn't say, well, I lost my job, I've got too many kids, I just need to mark some down.
Try and pick and choose that one.
Right, and neither should they be free to kill a preborn child already conceived and alive in the mother's womb. This is where pregnancy resource centers are well equipped to help parents in these crisis situations. Pregnancy resource centers like the Oaks Family Care Center are wonderfully equipped to help women in these situations, whether because of poverty or because they're teenagers and they're pregnant, they're scared and these things. There are many resources available to help them make ends meet to guide them toward resources that don't end the death of their child and the regret that will bring. And to say that the possibility of somebody suffering in poverty means they're better off dead is a dangerous economic policy to approach. When you extend that out to the living, it's unthinkable. She's pro Susan, who was sexually assaulted on her way home from work, only to come to the horrific realization that her assailant planted his seed in her, and she was, the way they write it even is to be dramatic. She got a positive pregnancy test a month later, or little Kathy, who had her innocence ripped away from her by someone who should have been able to trust, and her 11-year-old body isn't mature enough to bear the consequence of that betrayal. Yes, an 11-year-old could have gone through puberty. I think that's, again, trying to find the most hyperbolic, extreme example to sort of say, well, surely in this case, with all these circumstances, I mean, does she walk with a limp too? Does she, did she lose her job on the way home? It's like, how many different things can you stack up on it? So the case of always, we need to have exceptions for rape and incest. I'll talk about this a little more next week, but just in sort of short summary here, every instance of incest is rape. So when you say rape and incest, it's redundant. Let's not bury the lead on that one. That is rape. Rape is horrible, and the violence of abortion never undoes the violence and trauma of rape. It doesn't undo the rape. It compounds violence and trauma. And we're going to talk about that a little more next week with some stories from those who have been raped, become pregnant, and their decisions related to abortion and what they choose to do. The vast majority of women who become pregnant because of rape do not choose abortion. The vast majority do not choose abortion. The small percentage who do choose abortion, of them, the large percentage of them regret their abortion. And we'll hear some stories about that substantiate those statements next week. And just in short summary there, we don't punish innocent people for the crimes of someone else. The criminal penalty for rape, which is not death. I mean, should it be? I mean, I don't think any punishment could be severe enough. It's horrible.
Thank you.
And that's not the question that we're saying. They should be in prison. They should be prosecuted. They should face the penalties for those crimes. But we don't have any situations where a victim of a crime is killed because of somebody else's crime. Why does the child have a death sentence because of the crime of the father who's a rapist? Make sense? So next week we're going to hear some accounts from a book about those who become pregnant because of rape and why that is not a viable argument for allowances for abortion. But here's the other thing. Somebody's arguing with you is like, well, you got to certainly we should have exceptions for the case of rape. We'll say rape and incest, but rape. And you say, okay, we'll give you that. Everything else is banned. We'll give you rape and incest. And I'll show you a clip next week of a legislator posing that question to a pro-life advocate. She throws that back at him. He completely dodges it and ignores it, showing that that's not the issue. Even if we would allow it in those cases, which I'm not saying that that's a viable compromise, but I'm saying even if we allowed it, to take it from full-on elective abortion down to a small fraction of a percentage, I'd be all for that. But that's not what their argument ends up being, and that exposes that fallacy in their argument. So we'll pick up there next week.
Did you say that Wednesday, are you going to be at the funeral Wednesday?
Tuesday.
Tuesday is at night, though, right?
Correct. There's nothing Wednesday. Nothing Wednesday. Normal Bible study.